You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're looking at Wifredo Lam. Now, this one came as a listener request, so thank you and a shout out to Alejandro, but this one's really surreal to me because I could have sworn I had made this episode already. But in looking back at the feed, it looks like I never actually published it. I just wrote and prepped the episode, but it never got out there. Anyways, today we're going to look at Wifredo Lam and his masterpiece, The Jungle. Lam was born December 8th, 1902, in the small town of Sagua la Grande, Cuba. He was the eighth child of a Chinese immigrant father and a mother of mixed African and Spanish descent. And this multicultural heritage would influence his artistic development as much as anything he learned in art school. Growing up in Cuba, Lam developed a deep connection with nature. As a child, he loved exploring the surrounding countryside where he encountered the exotic flora and fauna that would later populate his paintings. Now, in addition to his artistic talents, Lam was also a gifted athlete. He played baseball and he boxed. It seems like Lam was raised to believe in the supernatural. His grandmother was a Santería priestess, and he was exposed to the rituals and beliefs of Afro-Cuban religion from a young age. This early immersion in Santería would later inform his artistic exploration of spirituality and mythology. He said one night in 1907, he was startled by the strange shadows of a bat in flight cast in his bedroom wall. And this incident, he said, was his, quote, first magical awakening to another dimension of existence, end quote. In 1916, Lam and his family moved to Havana. The city offered new opportunities and experiences. Initially, he pursued law, which his family encouraged, but his passion for art soon led him to enroll at the Escuela Profesional de Pintura y Escultura Academia de San Alejandro in 1918. This shift from law to art can be seen as a radical change, but the modernist approach is extremely analytical and seems fitting that people like Lam, Kandinsky, Cezanne, and others would start off in fields like law, economics, or engineering before taking up art. During his time at the Academy, Lam honed his skills in traditional painting techniques, but he also began to explore the more avant-garde styles of the day. He was particularly drawn to the works of European modernists like Picasso and Matisse. Now that I think of it, Matisse was another one who studied law before taking up painting. But in 1923, Lam received a grant to study art in Europe. And he went on a journey to Spain where he enrolled in the prestigious Academia de San Fernando in Madrid. There he studied under Fernando Álvarez de Sotomayor y Zaragoza, a renowned painter and curator of the Museo del Prado. While in Spain, he immersed himself in the country's rich artistic heritage. He spent countless hours in the Prado studying the works of Spanish masters like Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco. He said that, ironically, while he was studying all these great painters, he wasn't really doing that much painting himself in this period. He became really deeply immersed in the politics of the day. His time in Spain coincided with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. He joined the Republican side, fighting against the fascists. In a later interview, Lam would say that, quote, "This gave me a critical position towards many things that I had not had before. When I arrived in Paris after the fall of the Spanish Republic to the fascists, I began to paint what I felt most deeply. And in an automatic way, as the surrealists would say, the new world began to surface within me. In other words, I had carried all of this in my subconscious, and by allowing myself to produce automatic paintings, especially by means of that unexpected drawing whereby one does not know what one is going to paint, this strange world started to flow out of me. End quote. In 1938, with the Republican cause faltering, Lam fled Spain to France. He carried with him a letter of introduction to Pablo Picasso, and that friendship would prove pivotal in his career. Picasso was impressed by Lam's talent and his unique cultural background, and he welcomed Lam into his circle of friends. So through Picasso, he got to know other leading artists and intellectuals of the time, including André Breton, the founder of surrealism. And he began incorporating surrealist elements into his work, creating paintings that were kind of dreamlike, but also abstracted. We see these elements of different styles and different movements and even different cultures coming together on his canvases. In 1941, Lam returned to Cuba after that long hiatus. The island had undergone quite a bit of change during his time abroad, and he was struck by the social and political tensions that were all around him in his homeland. He began developing a unique style that blended Cubism, surrealism, and Afro-Cuban imagery. His paintings from this period often have these sort of enigmatic figures with elongated limbs and mask-like faces set against lush tropical landscapes. And that's really leading me perfectly into probably his most celebrated work, The Jungle. It was painted in 1943, and it was a massive undertaking. It was about 8 feet by 8 feet, gouache on paper, later mounted on canvas. The scale is an important element to the work. Lam wanted the viewer to feel physically overwhelmed by the composition. Now, while it's called The Jungle, the painting actually is not a literal wild jungle. It's a dense thicket of sugarcane stalks. And this is kind of an important distinction. Sugarcane is not an indigenous plant to Cuba. It was a crop introduced by colonizers that required the forced labor of enslaved Africans for centuries. By titling the work The Jungle, but painting a plantation, Lam is telling us that Cuba is a land where the natural environment has been replaced by a system of industrial exploitation. The composition here is really all about controlled chaos. We see 4 hybrid figures emerging from the vertical stalks of the sugarcane. These figures aren't quite human. They're abstracted with stretched out arms and legs, kind of mimicking the sugarcane stalks themselves, but they have big feet and their faces are really African-style masks. The anatomy is deliberately distorted. The disproportionately large feet ground the figures in the earth, while the heads reach into that dark blue-green void. The faces are particularly significant, drawing heavily from the geometric forms of West African masks. The presence of these masks in a Cuban landscape connects the Afro-Cuban diaspora with the continental African roots. The eyes of these masks are often crescent-shaped or almond-shaped, staring back at the viewer. It kind of confronts the viewer. We're no longer passive in our observation of this scene. We're kind of engaging with the figures. Now, there's a strong emphasis on the vertical with both the sugarcane stalks and the limbs of the figures. All of this verticality kind of creates a visual cage, creating a sense of claustrophobia in here. I mean, we see this sort of landscape, but there's no horizon line, no sky. We're trapped inside a field with these humanoid kind of spirits, deities. I don't quite know who or what they are. And this lack of perspective was kind of a rejection of European landscape traditions, which were typically very tidy and organized. Instead, Lam presents the land as something untamed, spiritual, and resistant to ownership. The color palette gives it a kind of cool nocturnal effect. Like it's all happening under the moonlight. And I think that relates really directly to his childhood experiences. I mean, his grandmother was a Santería priestess, and Santería ceremonies were often held at night under the cover of darkness to avoid persecution. Lam painted the jungle in his Havana studio during a time when the Cuban government was promoting rumba culture, a sterilized, tourist-friendly version of Afro-Cuban life. Lam famously said that his goal was to create something hostile that would, quote, disturb the dreams of the exploiters, end quote. He wanted to produce work that could not be sold as a souvenir or used as a postcard. His work was about challenging the viewer. And it's interesting because it's these cooler tones in here, lots of blues, and yet it doesn't feel at rest or relaxed. There's an urgency. And maybe that's because of all the fragmentation that comes from like that Picasso cubist influence, or the like directness of that like automatic drawing and the spiritual symbols all just sort of pouring out onto the canvas. I mean, maybe it's a combination of all of these things, but you know, like a lot of modernist works, it feels like there's so much more to this than what we're directly seeing on the canvas. It feels like every inch of this is loaded with symbolism, getting at these deeper truths about humanity and culture and, you know, where he came from and where he sees people going. When the jungle was first exhibited in New York in 1944, it was kind of met with a bit of confusion among the critics. Many American critics were not familiar with sort of the nuances of the Afro-Cuban spirituality, and they struggled to categorize this piece. As I said, it's kind of this mix of different influences, and people always have a hard time when it doesn't fit neatly into one category. Some saw this as derivative of Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which feels really painfully ironic when you consider how Picasso was borrowing from African motifs. Really, Lam is more kind of reclaiming those elements that Picasso had been taking and appropriating into his own work. The Museum of Modern Art, though, saw the value in this, and they bought the painting in 1945. But for many years, it was famously displayed in the hallway leading to the coat room. And this placement was a point of contention for a lot of art historians who argued it reflected the museum's inability to see non-Western artists as a central figure in modernism. But in the late 20th century, the painting was moved to the main galleries, where it's now recognized as one of the most important works in the collection. And in some ways, that museum treatment feels kind of fitting because the jungle ultimately feels like it's about the act of reclamation. Lam took the visual language of the European avant-garde, the people who had, quote, discovered African art in the early 1900s, and used it to tell a story of African survival and the spiritual power of the New World. By blending the botanical, the human, and the divine, Lam created a new kind of modernism that was, yes, global or universal, but also local and deeply personal.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.